You are listening to Written in the Stars, Books and Beyond, where hosts from the LCC Library sit down with writers, publishers, entrepreneurs, and literary enthusiasts of all types. Join your hosts, Amy Ewald, Robin Moore, John Szilagyi, and Abby Tebow as we explore the very heart of the written word. Welcome to Written in the Stars, Books and Beyond. I am John Szilagyi, and beside me is my co-host, Robin Moore. Today, we are joined by poet Cruz Villarreal. Cruz has published poetry online and regularly performs his works on stage. Cruz started his college journey at the age of 56 and completed a degree in creative writing here at LCC. Cruz has a wealth of life experiences that he captures in his poetry. His works can be found at cruzpoet.openlcc.net. Cruz, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Wow, thank you for that, man. That was good. That was good. Right on it. Thank you.
Well, so glad to have you here today.
Welcome, Cruz.
First question, can you tell us about your journey into poetry? What initially sparked your interest in poetry? And how has your relationship with poetry evolved over time?
Well, I've always, as a child, I always wrote poetry, you know, the silly stuff. And when you're a teenager, it's romantic and you fall in love with the girl next to you, right? You're writing your little poem and stuff like that. And it went over well. Okay. Don't get me wrong.
Okay.
It worked. It did its thing and it evolved over time. And then you get into adulthood and then it's reality sets in and you go to work, so you drop it. It wasn't until I decided to go back to school and I took creative writing, and I took a lot of the poetry that I had written back as a youngster and polished it up and then wrote some new things. And with the help of good instructors and a lot of editing and a lot of little groups where you get together and you peer review everything. Mm-hmm. So I refined a lot of the poems. And then you're just impacted. At that age, at 57, 58, I'm impacted more by things that go on around you, right? The world itself. And so social justice became an issue. I would walk around the river walk and I'd notice, you know, homeless people under bridges, things like that. So a lot of my poems have to do with that type of theme. And then I had a lot of other things. I had my own life experiences that I had an opportunity. People actually encouraged me, write what you know, right? So I just started writing about life as a migrant child, life as a Latino in a white world with no identity, right? You see the world through white eyes while the world sees you in a brown way. So it does things to you, right? All your heroes are tall, they're white, y no se habla español. Okay, so that's the world I grew up in, and so a lot of my writing has that. I had to get past self-loathing, because in my era that, you know, you grew up with words like lousy Mexican, dumb Mexican. So after a while, when you hear that growing up, you begin to believe it. And next thing you know, you're hesitant to hire, a Latino doctor. You're hesitant to hire a Latino lawyer. You're hesitant to hire a Latino anything, because you've been hypnotized over all those years to believing that they aren't capable, that they can't step up to the challenge. But that only happens here in this country. As I got older and I began to interact with people from Latin American countries, where it's the norm, okay, to be a professional, right? And so no one looks at you that way, right? They are surprised that here you would think that way, right? So I learned a little bit about self-loathing only through going back to school and actually delving into an education where you're exposed to the right kind of classes and you learn those things.
Wow.
You've talked a little bit about it already, but a lot of your poems have themes of politics, you know, and political issues in them. And, you know, you've spoke a little bit to that, but you talked about a couple different kinds of poetry, like the romantic stuff, but then like the political stuff. And from your point of view, like what is the role of politics in poetry?
It It depends on how you're impacted. For example, when back in 2016, okay, it's when I really got stirred. I'd never experienced as much animosity toward being a person of color, and never saw so much hate for immigrants. It just like things that my parents had talked about their life back in the 40s and 50s, all of a sudden was becoming a reality to me, and I couldn't believe it that this is real. I thought we had come a long way, and so it had crushed me. And in fact, I wrote a very powerful, dynamic poem, and I performed it at the Robin Theater, and it spoke to all those issues. And yes, but sometimes you got to temper it a little bit, right?
Yeah.
You don't censor yourself, but when I'm moved or I'm incensed about something, yes, all of a sudden the pen comes out and I write it, and then I'm looking for an opportunity for an open mic to share it. And but usually I'm preaching to the choir.
Sure.
They usually agree with me anyway.
Cruz, I'm so glad you're in this space today. Thank you for everything that you've shared thus far. You already talked about inspiration from various sources, what inspires you to write poetry. Now, do you have any specific ritual or practices that help you tap into your creativity besides the young lady when you were younger next door that you wanted to write a poem to? No.
The process is you write what you know. I was having a conversation with a friend, and I began reminiscing about food that I grew up with.
I read that poem.
Oh, you actually? Oh my goodness! You read that?
I did.
And he was so like, oh wow! He goes like, because I'm very expressive and a lot of images just in me the way I talk.
Yeah.
And he says, dude, you need to write that poem, right? So I never thought of that, and so we began the process of writing that poem. And rewriting that poem and rewriting that poem. And then I found a group that was willing to workshop it with me. And that's where you get the results of, tortillas de harina, tacos de barbacoa, those type of poems that speak to those things. But one of my friends says that I'm more of a storyteller poem. My poems tell a story. So I'm not so much the type of writer that is abstract. I've read some very good abstract poetry, just like images pop at you, right? And you're just reacting to all these things. Mine have to have a little story.
Right.
And very similar to that one, you may have read it, Cactus and Patron, where a conversation between me and God, and God's a Pachuco. So we're having very good conversation. And that poem had an interesting evolution. I took a Hebrew course here, Hebrew books, went in our religion section, and I was fascinated by the story of Job. Okay? So, I thought the idea, a guy that has a conversation with God, what kind of, how's that thing working out? So a relationship thing, actually talking back and forth. And said, well, I can write that. And then I began to write it. And as I wrote it, I was God, right? And then I workshopped it, and they said, why are you? Why don't you speak to God? And then God has his own voice instead of you being all philosophical. And it totally changed the dynamics of that poem. Instead of me saying something philosophical and really cool, God was saying philosophical things and cool things, which you would expect of God, right?
Right.
And not of a human being.
Right.
So the poem is really good. If you go there and read it, it's Cactus and Patron. It's really well played. And I grew up around my uncles who were Pachucos. That would be the zoot suit guys, feathers in your hat, and
I get
khaki
it.
pants, Stacey Adams shoes. It was really cool.
Yeah.
They were cool guys, and they had their own lingo. And that kind of rubbed off on my generation of Latinos. I use a lot of Pachuco words when I'm talking Spanish with other people.
Now, what does that mean again?
Pachuco?
Yeah.
It's actually a subculture type thing.
Okay.
They took indigenous words mixed them with Spanish words, and created language.
Interesting.
And they knew within their own subculture what they were talking about.
Mm.
And it was maybe a little rebellious thing that was going on back in the 30s and 40s.
Okay.
And that there are still pachucos. You can look up, do a Google for pachucos, and you get these cool-looking people in zoot suits still today.
Well, I'm going to look it up as soon as I leave here.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, maybe you heard the zoot suit riots.
Totally.
Yep, I've
Okay,
heard
that
of
history.
Mhm.
That's
Yes.
pachucos.
Okay.
Yeah, the people were mad because it would spend so much money on their suits in a time in an era when people were rationing
Yes.
because of the war, and but they felt it was unfair the things that were going on, so they would rebel, and so yes, they would intentionally wear those clothes. And that era of America took that as anti-American, and so a lot of hatred and a lot of fighting, and the racism, of course, it was still very prevalent. Was there. So, yeah, it's a fascinating story, the Zoot Suit riots.
I love how we're getting a history lesson
Yeah, it's great.
by Cruz. Amazing. Look, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Cruz, for sharing.
To change gears a little bit, what's your writing process when you're writing a poem? Do you put a lot of like planning into it? Do you just sit down and write something right off the top of your head? What's your process?
I write this very long paragraph, and I write the actual story, whatever's going on in my head, whatever's going on in my heart, whatever I'm feeling, I write it out. And it might be a paragraph, might be 2 paragraphs, might be a page. And then I go back and I say, how can I say this with less words? And then I begin looking at where can I use a metaphor? Where can I show it in an image instead of saying it in words? And I begin tearing that up, and it begins getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then I begin breaking it down into stanzas. And then I take the stanzas, and I see what they sound like, see if they still have a beat, see if they still have a rhythm. Do they make sense? And then I shuffle around the stanzas. I'll move them up here, I'll move them down here, and I see what that does. I'll take certain words and I'll synonym them. I'll do a check for what other word will work better, what other word has more impact, says more. So yeah, go through a lot of that. How can I make this say a lot with less words? A poem that does that is Shopping Cart. If you had a chance to read Shopping Cart, talks about the homeless, but it's not that long a poem. But all the images that finally settled into that, you get the entire point, and then it ends with why. Just ends with that word, right? Why.
Yeah.
That's the process, and it can take. I have put poems away for months. Months. I don't even publish them. I don't try to, and I'll go back and revisit that poem, and it will either be this is really stupid, yucky, this stinks, and won't work on it anymore, or I'll say, you know what, this needs this, this needs that, and then I'll be engaged with that poem for hours, days, right? I may even dream with it, and then it just comes to life. It's almost like sometimes poetry comes knocking at your door. I have had dreams, and maybe it's just the way my brain works, right? Yeah. And I'll wake up and I'll write down the images in those dreams or what that was about, and then try to make sense of it and begin writing into those images. But every poet does it a little bit different, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. So poetry, Cruz, can seem difficult to read and understand. We talked about your writing process. Let's get into this reading. What does poetry uniquely offer readers, and what tips or advice do you have for reading poetry? Sometimes I get confused with reading poetry, Cruz.
You can never, you should never read a poem just once. Okay. Every word that the poet puts in that poem is intentional.
Yeah.
It wasn't a mistake. There's a reason there that it's misspelled. There's a reason it's where it's at. It's the reason it ends a certain way. I use a little bit of form. I don't use a lot of form. I'm pretty much a little free verse type thing going on. but it doesn't mean that I didn't learn form. Okay, so form helps me structure my, even though it's free verse, form does help me, right? Because I need rhythm, I need beat, and I need to drive the reader down. If I want the reader to get this point down here, I need to have that reader travel with me, right? And I do that with or without punctuation. And so without punctuation, the reader is forced to keep going until there's punctuation. And that's where I wanted you to stop. It was intentional why I put that comma there, or why I put a period there, or why I put, an em dash in there. Every punctuation is like a different level of stopping.
Yeah.
It's like a comma's a yield, a period is a stop, an em dash is, I guess I got to go around that log.
Yeah.
So it tells you those things. So you do have to know a little bit about punctuation. So when you should stop, when you shouldn't. And if you don't see punctuation, you're not supposed to stop.
Right.
You just, look for that beat and keep reading. But sometimes the message can be hard, and you've got to read it and read it and read it and read it until I get it.
Yeah. I like how you said that you take the reader on a journey, because when I'm reading poetry, I feel like I'm on a trip. It's like, okay, where am I? What direction? So that's so true. You're taking us, the reader, on this path. Yeah, I like how you said that, Cruz. I just had to share that.
And sometimes you are surprised by what the reader gets out of it.
Yes.
May not necessarily be or what I meant, right? But I'm pleased at what you got out of it. It's like, wow, what a bonus, right?
Yeah.
I was over here when I wrote that, and you are over here where you're understanding it, and this is still a cool place to be.
Yeah.
And you always get a kick out of when somebody finds a meaning that they found relevant, or what your poem did for them.
Have you ever had a reader that came up to you and was like, they got something out of it, but it was like, what's an example of, do you have an example of that where a reader has shared that with you and you were like, well, that wasn't what I was thinking, but that's great. Do you have an example?
Yeah. I won't name the poem because
that's fine.
I like where it went, where the guy took it, right? We're leaving that there, okay?
Yeah.
I wrote it because I was just really writing something I had gone through that day, just events. It was just one event after another. I guess the way it was presented, the reader took it into, yeah, man, that's like, wow, wheels inside wheels, like systems into systems. I go, oh, okay. I was just talking about being in the car, on top of four wheels. But hey, I like that. I'm in my head. I'm not telling him that I was in the car steering and it was wheels inside wheels, okay?
Yeah.
So, okay. Yeah, those moments could happen, John.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, that's great. And it's great that readers have that connection with you as well. So, yeah. One other thing I wanted to talk about, too, a theme that comes up in a lot of your poetry is childhood and memories. And I was wondering if you could speak a little to that. Why is that such a reoccurring theme in your poetry?
Myself, it's a way you deal with grief when you realize at a certain age that you are dealing with grief. Okay? My father was a good man, but he was an alcoholic. And when there's alcoholism in the family, people going to suffer, right?
Yeah.
Because the money you had mom had planned for something else turned out to be bail money, okay? Because stuff happens, right? And or you hear your mom telling the cop not to hit your dad, right? Because they have to pick him up because he ran away from a stop, right? The cop's angry, right? And but you're, as a child, you're angry. You're throwing bricks at a cop car, right? So you grow up in poverty. And you don't realize you're grieving. So a lot of this work is just me processing the grief, right? Actually being able to now talk about it. Before, when I would write it, I was out here writing about a topic. And as I became more healed, I could now put myself in it. Like that poem, What I Learned When I Turned 9.
Yeah.
Okay? About the first time that I realized that I was a person of color and that I was a spick. That little boy changed my name. I no longer had a name. I was a spick, right? And my world totally, I saw it differently now. So yeah, that poem, What I Learned When I Turned 9, is about what I felt when my world was incinerated. At that point in my neighborhood, we didn't see color. The one thing that we all had in common is we were all poor. So that's what we saw, right? But when I was outside that world and I encountered someone, right? Yeah. A little boy my my size who stepped out and spit at me and angry at my little white friend who was with me. Right, so the poem is pretty. It's a good poem, by the way. That poem has been published in several online publications. It's a good one. That's one of my good ones.
Yeah, I agree. I read that one, and it definitely stuck with me. And I think when I was thinking about that question, that was definitely one of the poems that was sticking out in my mind. So
yeah, so it's you're grieving even at 71.
Yeah,
I still, if you read the short story, The Passing. It's in the nonfiction section of the website. That is the story of my mother's death. That was about grieving. And that one, when I was in school, that one got me the land award, right?
Great.
I forget what we even call it now, right? I think we still have the land contest.
It is the land contest.
I won that one that year because of that short story.
Congratulations.
So it's all about grieving.
Great.
And the Christmas story. That it got a lot of mileage. It was in the City Pulse. One Christmas season.
Wonderful.
And then the next season, I was asked to read it at a 10-pound fiddle event. And that as well is also about sharing that experience. But it's really, even though it sounds sad, it's really a happy ending. It's a very, believe it or not, it's a happy ending. Okay?
Yeah. First, I want to say you're not 71, you're 24. This is a great segue. Performing is an important aspect of sharing your poetry with audiences. How do you approach performing your poetry, and do you find that the delivery of the poem can change its meaning? We kind of talked about this, but change the meaning or the impact that you're displaying.
Yeah. I don't know why I can read with feeling, inflection. I seem to naturally know when to say it a certain way, and the body language, and when to drop my voice and when to raise my voice, and how to speak with emphasis. I don't know if that can be taught. I don't know that anyone taught it to me. It's just that's how I feel the poem. And sometimes I can't finish a poem or a story because I am so deeply in it, and I'm relating the event, and the imagery is so vivid that sometimes I choke up because it's like I'm in a time capsule and I've just been teleported back to that day. And so, yeah, sometimes I tend to get a little choked up. But that's all I'm doing. I'm just feeling the poem and reading the poem, and I just happen to have a knack for swallowing the microphone and having a good inflection.
Yeah, I think that's important, feeling the poem. I'm glad that you shared that. It's great to feel that because you're able to deliver so that you can really attract the audience. So, yeah.
Before we end here, what advice would you give to aspiring poets who are just starting their journey in writing poetry?
Well, the nice thing is that you will always find that poets dig poets. Okay.
Yeah.
Poets dig poets.
Yes.
Not everyone will get what you're saying, okay, but you'll always have a safe space at an open mic where there's poets.
Yeah.
But you do have to write what you know, what you feel. Those are your words. That's your journey. That's your experience. Don't worry. Somebody is digging it.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Not everyone will, but somebody's digging it. Okay? They get it. And that's what I love about the Poetry Room, the Lansing Poetry Club, that there are so many venues, so many places that are safe spaces, because you do. I'll go to an event and I'll see some kid up there pouring their heart out, right? Yeah. They're laying there, they're bleeding out there, okay? They bled on the page and now they're bleeding on the stage. and you feel it, and and they're getting so much out of it. They're healing from whatever it is. One poet told me that I was just a poet in mourning. Because so much of my you've read it, so yeah, he said you're just a poet in mourning, buddy. That's just all it is. And some poets are like, they're not in that space. They're someplace else, and thank God, right?
Yes.
For the way they write. Like Mary Oliver, I love her work, very nature, right? And I love that. I love reading her work. I love reading it out loud. It's just like great stuff, And then there's some spoken word poets, like. Wow, to do that.
Yeah.
How do you do that? I've got to have my iPhone with me, and I'm reading, right? I just have to learn to read with emphasis. They're not.
Yeah.
That's just pouring out.
Yeah.
So, I envy that. But, we all got our little niche, and even that new poet, they got their own niche.
Yeah. So what are you working on right now?
Right now, I just finished one. It's called the Migrant Mother's Song. That one, I have one aunt left from that era of the 40s and 50s, and it is their story as migrant children who were American-born, okay, who grew up in the era of forced repatriation. So it didn't matter if you were American-born, you were brown, you were busted, and you were shipped back to Mexico and figure it out, right? Yeah. So those raids happened. There was about segregation. It was not like in the South where it was imposed by Jim Crow laws. These were just people who chose to segregate Latino kids and put them in, their own schools where they could teach you to be farm workers and hotel housekeepers. And it was the era when my uncles told me they were Korean War vets who came back in an era when they had to confront no Mexicans or dogs allowed. That was their world. The opportunities were go back to the fields. In those days, the field work, it took the whole family to make payroll, to be able to make ends meet. And it was a hard life. So I give a lot of credit to the Farm Workers Union, okay? The work that was done by the Filipinos in California, taken up by the Latinos and Cesar Chavez, and all those who advocated for a Farm Workers Union. Those people have a much better life now. They have health benefits. They have vacation. They have an opportunity to one day leave that field, not die in that field. My father, in his 60s, when he was displaced from a factory, had his first stroke because he was forced to go back in his late 60s into the tomato fields because the factory he was working at wanted a much younger workforce. It was Hubbard Honey. They got rid of all their older laborers because that's all Dad knew how to do. He knew hard labor. But at his age, there was not any place you could go. So other than back into the fields, and when he got his first stroke, that's where he found him in a tomato field. Back to what he knew how to do. From there, the family took care of him. So, the Migrant Mother Song tells you that story. Okay. And when I read it, there's usually the national anthem playing in the background. Okay. Kind of, like Dr. King said, right? A check that needs cashing, right? You made some promises and
cash that check.
And it wasn't delivered on.
Ooh.
Right? And so all the work that migrant farm workers did for this country, the reason you could buy a 25-cent hamburger with lettuce on it, right, is because somebody was suffering. Or I remind people that in this country, labor laws are different for people who work in ag. You can work as young as 14 in this country in an ag field, and 12 if you have your parents' consent. And if you want to make rent, guess what? You're going to get that consent. So there might be some little teenage girl donning a plastic bag because she's got to go into a tobacco field early in the morning, and she's trying to keep that nicotine from dripping onto her. And there are children who suffer nicotine poisoning. Those things still happen, right? Or a teenager is spending his summer in a berry field somewhere, or in a fruit tree, not at Cedar Point, not at the lake. Okay, the real cost of tomatoes, the real cost of apples, the real cost of fruit, berries, okay, is human suffering and human labor. So when a company, which is now, farms are billion-dollar corporations now. They're not the little family farm that we want to sympathize with. These are billion-dollar corporations, and they don't want unions. And so I like to remind people that what it costs.
That's right.
Thank you for being on today, Cruz. And can you just remind everybody where they can find your work?
Thanks to LCC, you can find it at cruzpoet.openlcc.net. It's free, doesn't cost anything. You got to register for it. You can even leave a comment.
Well, thank you so much for being on today, and it was great to talk with you.
You're amazing, Cruz.
Thank you. Thank you.
You have been listening to Written in the Stars, Books and Beyond. Visit lcc.edu/library to find the titles discussed in this episode. You can find previous episodes of Written in the Stars and other LCC Connect shows at lccconnect.com. In the words of Miguel de Unamundo, I hope, reader, we shall meet again and we shall recognize each other.